World War II began on September 1st, 1939. While it was a complex battle globally, there were two distinct sides. The Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan battled the Allied powers of the Soviet Union, France, the United Kingdom, China, and eventually the United States. The Empire of Japan was seen as an aggressive force to leaders in America even before World War II began. The Japanese victory over Russia and the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 was the first defeat of a Western nation by an Asian nation in modern times. When Japan invaded China in 1937 and then formed an alliance with Nazi Germany and Italy in World War II, the United States was watching. The Empire of Japan was on a mission to reunify Asian countries and expand its dominance around the world. They were seen by most countries as a serious threat. The Alien Registration Act of 1940 required all people the U.S. government saw as aliens over the age of 14 to be registered and fingerprinted, and shortly after, the FBI began a list identifying German, Italian, and Japanese individuals they thought could be dangerous if America formally engaged in the war. As tensions rose and the threat of conflict with Japan escalated, the Japanese Nisei living on the West Coast saw what might come if Japan attacked their country. Fears of retribution, imprisonment, and even execution were real, so the decision to show loyalty to America led to the formation of the Japanese American Citizens League. The JACL became a strong, patriotic voice for those of Japanese ancestry in California's Central Valley.
The 1940s, an interesting transition had taken place in the Japanese community. In 1920, 73% of the Japanese community was foreign-born. By 1940, in the 1940 census, 37% only was foreign-born. That meant that the Issei, who are the foreign-born portion of the Japanese population, the first generation, had now been actually eclipsed by a growing and much larger second generation, a generation born in the United States, the Nisei.
In the late summer of 1941, life in Fresno, California was good. While eyes were on Hitler's advances in Europe and the expanding aggressions of Japan, everyday life continued as usual in the city and agricultural countryside. In October of '41, the big Fresno Fair drew record crowds as it still does today. Parking lots filled, families enjoying the long, late summer days, unaware that in less than 2 months their country would be at war. On November 7th, exactly 1 month before the Pearl Harbor attack, Curtis B. Munson's report on the West Coast Japanese Americans landed on President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's desk. Munson was a successful businessman who was commissioned by the State Department to investigate the reaction of people of Japanese ancestry, legal citizens or not, if Japan attacked the United States. Munson's report concluded that most of the West Coast Japanese were loyal to America, and a widespread uprising or revolt was highly unlikely. U.S. Army intelligence wrote their assessment of the Munson report shortly after it was submitted to the President. The Army agreed with Munson's findings and stated that identification of potentially dangerous Japanese on the West Coast was complete, and that sabotage by the general Japanese American population on the West Coast was not expected. That Army intelligence report never made it to the President's desk. The Japanese military had begun making plans to attack the United States in early 1941, even as the Japanese government was in active negotiations with America to prevent war. Japanese war planners thought a preemptive strike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor would limit the ability of the United States to interfere with Japan's ambitions to take over British colonies in Southeast Asia, Singapore, and the Philippines. On November 26, 1941, a naval strike force of 6 aircraft carriers left Japan and headed towards the Hawaiian Islands. Diplomatic negotiations between Japan and the United States were deteriorating. We now know those negotiations were never intended by the Japanese to succeed. They were part of a distraction effort to move the carrier strike group into position and attack with full surprise before any formal declaration of war was made. Early in the morning of December 7, 1941, 353 Japanese aircraft launched from the carriers in 2 waves. They headed for the island of Oahu, their target the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. For an hour and a half, death rained down on American forces and civilians at Pearl Harbor, the sounds of war shattering the quiet of a peaceful Sunday morning. When the attack ended, 2,403 Americans were killed. Nearly 1,200 were severely injured, and the Pacific Fleet was left burning. America declared war on Japan and officially entered World War II. And for 120,000 Japanese immigrants and Americans living on the west coast of the United States, life was about to change.
That was an early Sunday morning, and you know, I'm a tennis player from way back, and I played on the high school tennis team. And this is early Sunday morning. It's about 7 o'clock, 7:30 on Sunday morning. And as we were playing tennis, a car stopped by the side of the road in Livingston at the high school, and there were about 3 men in the car. And they got out and started to curse at us and called us all kinds of names and made it very uncomfortable. So we left, and when we got home, listening to the radio, we found out that Pearl Harbor had happened. And that's how we first became acquainted with what was happening.
I distinctly remember saying, what a stupid thing Japan is doing. Who do they think they are, bombing our country? And about a couple of weeks later, I began to hear rumors that we were partly responsible because we were accused of not being loyal to America, and the rumors were going around that we should all be rounded up and put into a concentration camp.
We didn't have much of a TV then, I guess, but I remember reading it. It just didn't seem possible something like that happened, but it did.
There was a lot of talk before Pearl Harbor. The media was playing up with all the anti-Japanese sentiment. There was a lot of propaganda. People were starting to have some sentiment that was anti-Japanese, but it wasn't until after the bombing that things got really ugly.
I didn't know about it until I went to school the next morning. And then things were so weird. My friends weren't talking to me. My classmates weren't talking to me, and they pretended that they didn't even see me walking down the hallway. And I thought, now what did I do that changed things so much?
The shock of a sneak attack on American soil caused widespread hysteria and paranoia across the country. These fears were amplified when Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy in Roosevelt's administration, blamed Pearl Harbor on a wildly successful espionage effort by Japan, instead of the more damaging truth that the local military in Hawaii was ill-prepared for exactly what happened. This exaggeration helped the American people maintain confidence in the Navy but fueled sensational news reports and stories of sabotage and imminent invasion by Japan that were simply untrue. Military leaders here and in Japan had already crunched the numbers and had come to the conclusion that a full-scale invasion by either country wasn't feasible. Findings that were never shared with the public. War hysteria and anti-Japanese sentiment was made worse by several events that happened directly after the Pearl Harbor attack. On December 7, 1941, a single Japanese warplane, damaged by U.S. ground fire in the Pearl Harbor attack, crash-landed in a field on the relatively unknown Hawaiian island of Niihau, west of Kauai. The pilot survived and was taken in by several Japanese people that lived on the remote island amongst the native Hawaiians. A few days later, when villagers learned of the attack on Pearl Harbor by radio, it was decided to turn the pilot over to the military on nearby Kauai. But by then, the pilot had convinced his Japanese hosts to aid him in getting his gun and papers back so he could escape to a submarine that would pick him up and return him to the fleet. A fight broke out between the two parties. A local Hawaiian named Ben Kanahili and his wife Ella fought the Japanese pilot as he scrambled for a gun. When it was over, the pilot was dead, but not before Kanahili suffered 3 gunshot wounds that almost ended his life. One of the Japanese residents that had come so quickly to the aid of the pilot committed suicide on the spot. News of the Niihau incident reached Washington, D.C., and fanned the flames of hate that were growing against the Japanese American population. If one downed pilot could turn 3 Japanese Americans against the United States in a matter of hours, how many more plots to strike America from within were out there?